welcome to the CSS Grad Student Caucus panel on getting a job when you want to work on comics. I want to start by thanking ICAF very much for giving us space and time to talk about this. And I also want to say thanks to the CSS Executive Board for supporting a grad student event as the very first CSS event at ICAF, sponsored event at ICAF. And it was really good to hear Charles Hatfield in his opening remarks yesterday that if we're not making jobs and opportunities for grad students, then, quote, we're not doing anything. So the CSS, just as a reminder, the CSS Grad Caucus is having elections, which will start online tomorrow. So if you're a grad student and a CSS member, please do vote and be involved in that. So the way this is going to go is I will introduce the panelists, and they will make some opening remarks, and then we'll take the conversation from there. I have some questions, but I hope also to get the audience involved relatively quickly. So we'll just go to my left. Frederick Byrne-Collette is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Calgary. His research focuses on the political uses of comics, including representations of race, gender, and sexuality. He's the author of several articles on such artists as Phoebe Gloeckner and Julie Doucet, and the editor of the forthcoming special issue of Substance that examines the intersection of comics and anarchist thought and practice. He's also the recipient with Bart Beatty of a research grant for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for a multi-year project examining the comics and cartoons of Charlie Hebdo. Then slightly further to my left is Andrea Gilroy. Yes, Andrea Gilroy. And she's currently at the University of Oregon in the Department of Comp Lit. She got her PhD from there in June 2015. That work was titled Origin Stories, Narrative Identity in Comics Form. And so she's currently a postdoctoral instructor for CompLit there, but she is about to become interim director for the Comics and Cartoon minor, and at the same time visiting assistant professor in English and CompLit. And then furthest to my left is Susan Kirtley, a professor at Portland State and also director of their Comic Studies program. Thanks very much to these guys for being willing to talk about this topic, and I guess I will hand it over to Frederick for opening remarks. One other thing, Teresa Rojas was scheduled to be on this panel. She was unable to make it, ironically, because she has a job interview in California. So if, while you're listening to this panel, you would cross your fingers, send her good vibes, that would be a good thing. Okay, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, I feel a little funny being here on a panel called How to Get a Job, because I don't have a job. I do have a postdoc, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I guess I'll start by saying that, there are no jobs in comics studies, right? Like, those of us working on comics are sort of realizing, maybe too late, that there are actually no jobs in this field. Like, the first job I think that was posted was the University of Dundee job. That I interviewed for this job and went to the campus, and even they seemed a little bit confused about what they were hiring. Like what are we doing? Like what is comic studies? Like what kind of person do we want? And so I think that the sort of takeaway from that is that everybody should expect to get hired teaching something else, right? And I think that the people in this room who have jobs, by and large, got hired to teach something else, to do something else, and then sort of smuggle comics in along the way. So what that means is that for my applications, and I guess for everybody else, is that you really have to reinvent yourself for every single application, right? Like, you have to figure out how does what you do respond to this ad, to this need. So that means that it's very time consuming, because you have to all of a sudden sort of re-envision your whole academic trajectory as something else, right? You're not a comics scholar. You're someone else who does work on comics, right? For example, I have an upcoming interview in American Studies in the UK, and so for that, I'm going to have to figure out like how is what I do really American Studies, right? Like how do I stress that angle? So while there are no jobs, comics are still everywhere, right? Like everybody is excited about comics, and I think that one of the best examples of that is my colleague in Calgary, Nick Sousanis, who I'm sure most of you are aware of his book and his sort of extraordinary success with this book, with getting everybody to talk about comics and how to integrate comics into various other fields and teaching practices. And he's traveling around giving keynotes every 2 weeks everywhere, and you know, he's really like a good example of how much interest there is in comics everywhere. But the big challenge is to translate that into some sort of actual jobs in the field, right? Everybody's really excited about like sort of the potential of comics, what comics can do in other fields, or how comics can like bring a new angle to something, but very few departments or deans or other bodies with decision-making power are really willing to go that last step and hire someone, right? So I will say, however, that so because comics is sort of, you know, it's an interesting hip field in a lot of ways, and then there is all this interest, and I think one of the reasons that I've had success with getting postdocs, I actually managed to get 2 different postdoc grants from various Canadian funding bodies, and I think that there's success there because it's a short-term investment, and it's independent of, you know, like a institutional 30-year commitment to hire me to teach comics, right? So in Canada, we're very lucky that we have a very solid framework for public research funding, and that is independent of field, right? So if you have a project that's really strong, that gets evaluated on the same, on an equal footing with someone doing a more traditional thing. So I'm very fortunate to have access to that, and I've had some luck so far getting these grants, but I think like I still feel the immense challenge of like the next step, right? Someone has to actually want to hire me for potentially 30 years or something, and that's the challenge. I have some sort of specific advice, but I think I'll save that for later for the discussion. But that's it.
So sort of building on some of what Frederick said, it's true that there really aren't any jobs necessarily in comics studies. But I think probably very few of us here have degrees in comic studies, so there's a certain amount of expectation in that. Probably you have a degree in some sort of literary studies or American studies or cultural studies, or X number. You are doing a sort of comic studies work within a different program. So part of your work in choosing to do comic studies as a discipline may be as important to you to think about at some level, explaining to, depending on what stage you are in your graduate student career, explaining to your committee about why you want to, say, write a comic studies dissertation as opposed to have a chapter on comics texts as opposed to doing an entire dissertation on comics. That was a conversation I had with my committee. I decided to write a dissertation entirely on comics. One of my chapters deals with a novel. I look at The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde and some of its elusive sort of work that it does, particularly with Love and Rockets, but as well as some of the other sort of comics references that it makes. which is sort of the opposite of what many committees will sort of ask you to do, which is to write mostly about, quote unquote normal books, and then maybe have one chapter that does the comics thing. And often then, by the time that you're getting to the sort of cover letter stage of your graduate career, when you're writing your job letters, you'll have already been practiced in explaining why you've chosen to do this. So, I mean, that may be something to consider as well, that you will have some ability within to sort of describe your project and your place within your field. The other thing to keep in mind, and this was part of the reason that I made the decision to go sort of full comic studies, is that this is a really tough time in the market at all. It's not to say that there are no jobs, but there aren't a lot. And certainly the question of the sort of nature of the tenure track job in general, and the state of how the academic job position is looking is changing. And unless you're lucky enough to have sort of Harvard, an Ivy League name behind you, it becomes harder and harder to compete, which is not a slight if you're from Harvard, of course. You jerks. It just means that there's sort of a leg up that you often have. We all understand the reality of that situation. So, yes. So I sort of made that decision that, like, looking at my friends who did, Francophone, Caribbean literature, right? That's a pretty established field. There's a lot of places that do that kind of work. And they're having trouble getting jobs. My friends who are Victorianists, and they're having trouble getting jobs. So I'm going to do comic studies and I'm going to have trouble getting a job. Okay, like, I'm willing to make that sacrifice. There are also, you have to consider, of course, the realities of your life. My husband is a web developer. He is freelance and works from home, so I'm totally aware of the certain amount of sort of privilege I have in that sense. And not everybody has that kind of movability, that kind of ability to sort of move and take. So you need to be realistic about your ability to move, your ability to sort of make those kinds of choices. Another thing to consider, and this is something that is also sort of, I'm keenly aware of because I'm in comparative literature, this sort of eternal problem of the comparatists is that we're an inherently interdisciplinary and I would argue also intermedial field, as is, I think, the best work in comics studies. Because comics is intermedial by nature, you're dealing with both word and image. And I think the best comic scholarship tends to pull from a lot of different fields as well. And comparative literature often works similarly as well. We have on one side the ability to say, I can do a lot of really cool stuff. Like, hey, I can talk about translation, I can talk about world literature, I can talk about several fields. Isn't that cool? But then you're sometimes competing against people who are specialists. And depending on the job, that can sometimes be, it can be a difficult race. And if you're in comic studies, it's a similar kind of double-edged sword. So if you are, say, doing comic studies and you're competing against, an American literature person who, is really specific into like 80s and 90s contemporary American literature and a particular sort of field. And yeah, maybe you can also do popular culture theory and this kind of stuff, but if they're really looking for a literature position, it'll be difficult. So that's also something to talk about with your advisors and your committee, is about learning how to read the language of job postings, which is, it's its whole own language. It really is. And even so, you're never entirely going to get your head around it because it's purposely obfuscatory sometimes, I'm convinced. So 2 more points, and then I'll sort of pass it on to Susan. One is there's always going to be a certain amount, of course, in your job letters and talking to your committee of convincing that you have to do of like, yes, I'm a comic studies person, but here's why I think that I need to, or here's why I think that I can fit into your position for this number of reasons. But obviously you're here, and so to a certain extent you believe in the passion of your field. But in general, I would say the time for worrying about whether you need to explain why comic studies is a worthy field is gone. Don't spend time on it. If somebody questions you, for me, I think that like that time is past. Even if you study Shakespeare, somebody is going to disagree with you on your belief in Shakespeare. If you're like really influenced by the new critics, somebody else is going to be a new historicist and get angry at you. So I say, if you're doing brilliant and smart work, present it brilliantly, and ultimately, even somebody who doesn't necessarily think that comic studies is a thing will have a harder time arguing with you. As they sort of say in the internet parlance, haters gonna hate. Do your work, do it with confidence, present it with confidence, and don't worry about whether people in the room might not think comic studies is a thing. And in fact, that sort of movement to presenting yourself with confidence is one of the most important movements that you can make as moving from a graduate student into a sort of professional career. The final note, and this is something that's been really productive for me, and I know that there's some controversy in academic movements about comic studies, is that I have had a lot of productive relationships, and in part because of the kind of work that I do and the kind of text that I tend to study. I work a little bit more on some of the pop culture sides of comic studies. But working with fan communities and with creators, I've had a lot of productive relationships. I think that one needs to be careful because academic communities can sort of come in and try to sort of take over and elbow out fan communities, which are a certain kind of space that is meant for a certain kind of discourse. But we also don't want fan communities to sort of come in and have any sort of effect on the sort of rigor of academic discourse at the same time. So it's a delicate sort of balance, but it can be really mutually beneficial and really mutually inspiring. And there are lots of ways in which fan discourse and fan enthusiasm can be like really like spirit lifting, especially like when you're on the job market. And if you are working on contemporary media, despite the sort of critical stance of the death of the author, it can be really interesting sometimes to get in contact with authors who are alive and to discuss their material with them. It's a place to tread carefully, but it can be really fascinating. And so that's a decision for you to make as to whether or not it will help you find a job. It may help deepen your research, and it might help make you connections. And therefore, hey, it might help you find a job. I guess I lied. I have one final note. Look around you. I have, I didn't mean super literally, but you can. I have, as I've been to comparative literature associations, I've done the MLA thing, I've done all kinds of things. I've never met a community of scholars who are kind of as accommodating and welcoming and supporting as the folks, especially many of the folks here at ICAF. In my personal experience, Jose, Charles, Kiana, Susan, many more in the room who I'm probably woefully forgetting. This is a really welcoming and supportive community of scholars at many levels of their careers who are willing to offer advice and feedback, barring their own time. So, I would say, and now with the Comic Studies Society, they'll have some sort of force behind them to perhaps offer more institutional help as time passes, I'm sure. We're just getting started. So, make networks, build resources, both, if not financial, at least sort of interpersonal. And I'll hand it off to Susan.
All right, I'm going to speak briefly with images. I've realized that having done comic stuff for a while, I prefer to have images so you don't have to look at me because it wigs me out. So I'm going to speak, I timed it very briefly because these are the experts on finding jobs and you guys have a lot of questions and experience to share. And I'm an oddball. I have a tenure line position at Portland State. And so I'm going to give sort of a pep talk and rally. So a pep talk for you guys, knowing that we're out there advocating for people to get jobs, and also a rallying cry for those with tenured or tenure line positions to join me. And so I'm titling my 4-minute talk, "The Hero's Journey: Finding a Comics Job in the Academy." So I'm here because, like most everyone present, including Samuel Delaney, I think you can do things in comics that can be done in no other medium. As an aesthetic form, comics are irreplaceable. While the academic study of comics is certainly, as we can tell, it's on the rise, as evidenced by ICAF, Comic Studies Society, comics and comic scholars are still somewhat outsiders, particularly in universities. So what can and should we, as comic scholars, do for our field and our colleagues? So I'm going to briefly explore what I, as a tenured professor, am doing in the hopes of adding to our conversation, drawing in particular on the work I'm doing with the Comic Studies Society, the MLA, and the newly instituted Comic Studies program at Portland State University. In advocating for my colleagues in my field, I find inspiration from my first discipline, the sort of discipline I was raised in or grew up in, composition and rhetoric. There's a lot of crossover in these fields. They're both interdisciplinary. They both have had a struggle for legitimacy, and each of these fields is looking to find acceptance, authority, and a stable foundation within the academy, by which we can lobby for resources like courses, graduate funding, and tenure line hires. So what can we and what am I doing to help create these sort of jobs and positions? So first of all, working toward visibility and legitimacy. In an article on making the case for disciplinarity in rhetoric and composition, Phelps and Ackerman maintained that, quote, "External validation matters. Disciplinary status can't be willed from within, nor can it be solely written into existence, and that, quote, it is important as a field to generate and control our own data." So if comic studies, if we're going to thrive, we must create new programs and gather evidence to support our endeavors. So through events like, of course, ICAF, the Comic Studies Society, and the discussion group on graphic narratives at MLA. We're building these professional networks and forums, and we can use these opportunities to help one another. So I think we need to be working on that visibility and legitimacy. The other thing I'm working on is building a foundation. So comics and composition rhetoric share this focus on interdisciplinarity, as you guys have pointed out, and it makes these fields exciting, innovative, and really difficult to locate within an institution. So we all know the benefits of interdisciplinarity, but this multifaceted approach can cause challenges to find an appropriate place in the academy. Some comic studies programs are developing in English departments, some in art, some in other areas. Gregory Steirer argues that, quote, "Without the ability to position itself in relation to existing disciplinary formations, comic studies risks ghettoizing itself within the academy." So comic studies, like composition and rhetoric, can sometimes find it difficult to lobby for resources unless we have a stable foundation. So what is the answer? Do we cut ties with sponsoring departments or establish separate spaces? It's a real challenge. And my approach has been to build something working with my colleagues across the campus at Portland State. So we have an interdisciplinary comic studies program, which is just over 1 year old. It's a small program right now, but we have courses in English, like comics history and visual rhetoric. We have creative writing courses, like writing comics with industry professionals like Brian Michael Bendis and David Walker, and Diana Schutz from Dark Horse. We have Shannon Wheeler creating short comics. He does Too Much Coffee Man. He's in our art department. We also have manga classes. We have a class in Judaic Studies about Jewish comics creators, and we have our film department, et cetera, involved. So we're creating a really interdisciplinary program, drawing on our strength, and we're also reaching out to the community, as Andre was saying, working with creators like Brian Bendis, Douglas Walk, Nicole George, and David Walker just joined us recently. We're also reaching out and building relationships for this foundation with our community. So our students have internships with Dark Horse, Oni Press, and Milkfred Criminal Masterminds, and we've also already had several people getting hired. So some of my most promising students are facing a difficult choice between graduate school and jobs with Oni Press and other places. So it's another avenue to consider. And then finally, and again, so I'm hoping to expand this program, develop that foundation, and advocate for positions for you guys, which brings me to my final point with a a slide from CC Bell, who I met this morning. Oh my God, I'm so excited. It was awesome. She put me on Instagram, and I was so excited. My whole family, I had to tell them. Anyway, so I did not plan this slide knowing that I would meet her, but it's very exciting. So in any case, advocating. As comic studies develops, it would be wise to remember to use our visibility, our successes to advocate for others. Scholars Susan Marie Harrington and Linda Adler-Kanzer argue if we want to change the stories, we must reframe those stories with alternative ones that revolve around what we want, not what we don't want. So comic studies, we have the opportunity to write our origin story as a relatively new field, charting a course for the future. Personally, I will be lobbying for visibility, respectability for our discipline, a stable foundation from which we can lobby for additional resources, and I'll be working to develop new positions and opportunities. I would encourage all of us as comic scholars to look not just at what we aren't or what's not going well, but rather consider what it is we do well and all the opportunities we have, and think about what we want for our students, for our discipline, but especially in our successes to think about what we want for our colleagues, working together to create a field with room and funding for all of us. Thank you.